Part 5 of Before Crippin, Lancaster State Prison. At this time, when the Sunni and the Shia Muslims were on the same yard, a lot of the teachings that were dividing both were based upon the history of what took place, you know, in the last days and the following years of the death of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so during this rift, I knew most of the Shia brothers from Pelican Bay, but at the same time, I knew a lot of the Sunni brothers who had first introduced me to, Orthodox teachings outside of what I was first introduced to in the Nation of Islam. So I would hear both sides of the argument. Sometimes it even got, to the point to where it was about to get physical. So I found myself staying in the middle of it and trying to always keep suggesting to the brothers that I knew how to keep things mellow to where at least it didn't get to where, we had brothers fighting each other. At this time, I was working in the kitchen and I had some very interesting occasional run ins with people. And I always think it had to be something that Allah was trying to show me because it was always something that showed me that historical figures that I had read about, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and many others, accusations that they made were played out in some of the lives of the people that would come to tell me their stories. At this time, rap music was everywhere. Death Row Records was like the ghetto Bible hitting the streets where it just controlled the minds of everybody who was banging. I was seeing a different vibe from bangers that I did when we was on the streets listening to NWA. And so I noticed that a lot of the prison yards are starting to get filled up with a bunch of people, just coming in off the yards. And like I said, the prison was so wild and loose, and we had brothers that were Muslims that were still affiliated with their homeboys, and we had the differences in the beliefs, and so my mind was all over the place. I met a brother named Chip Fitzgerald. At this time, Chip had been down, I think, 31 years. He was a member of the Black Panther Party, and he was being held as a political prisoner. I was at the time going through my LAPD investigation that took place in Lancaster State Prison, where in a previous video I spoke on how they covered it up a couple of days before they had even come to speak to me. And so when I was explaining this to Chip, he noticed that I was the type of person, even though I was young, that I didn't think like most other people. When we held conversations, I was able to offer him information that was valid to the way that he thought, especially politically. The only thing that divided him and me was that the Black Panther Party were basically atheists, and they didn't hold belief in God. But when Chip told me his story and how long he's been fighting to get out of prison, he shared with me a lot of documents, even though they were redacted and, names and stuff like that were, blotted out. He was showing me how he was actually being held in prison because, you know, they feared that he, like Geronimo Pratt, would be an influence in ghettos in which it was just too, risky to allow him to get on the streets. And this is at the time when people going to the board were fighting tooth and nail, being denied almost every time that they go. They literally had to get out through the courts. And so after running in the Chip, there was a brother who I ended up coming in contact with named Pineapple. He was half Hawaiian and half Italian. And when he first moved in the cell with me, he noticed that I used to just sit up on my bed and I would read a lot. And it was strange to me that he was so much into blackness. He was sort of like the Fard Muhammad figure. He looked like a dark skinned person with the same type of hair. And he asked me, he was like, you carry yourself like a young G. And I was like, what you? I asked him. I said, what you know about a young G? I said, where you out of? He was, I'm from out the Bay Area, but he told me, his background and everything. So I'm like, oh, okay. And so the more, he started spitting at me, I'm thinking, damn, how you know so much about Crips and you from the Bay Area? And so he started showing something to me. He said, look, man, I got a cousin. He said, this right here is what they did to him. And so in this document, it was talking about the Crips and how his cousin was busted for arms trafficking and drug smuggling. And because he had Crip affiliations, they wanted to charge him under the RICO Act. And so he was arguing with his attorney, how could he be charged under the RICO Act when the Crips are a street, basically ragtag gang thrown together by a bunch of impoverished kids who basically feed on each other and others to survive. And in the document, it showed that when the Black Panther Party was being fought in Chicago, they started to send a chapter to Los Angeles. And I believe at the time it was going to be Bunchy Carter and another brother who were the leaders. Well, when they ended up being killed and Geronimo Pratt became the leader, we know that Pratt ended up in prison. Well, they were so much in fear of the Black Panther Party gaining members from a lot of street gangs that had not taken on titles like Crips or Bloods that they created an organization called the Community Resources Inner City Project. And they made people in society believe that any other version that Raymond Washington and a few of his associates had been the founders of the Crips would be like a wild conspiracy theory. But it made so much sense to me because, like every other figure that has been created on the international scene, everything lined up to put Raymond Washington in the same lineup as you would the 10 most Americas wanted, and the way that they have them now with the international terrorist list, where you have Bin Laden and Zawahiri and all the other figures, and they tell you these people that they're looking for. The same way that it was established overseas is the same way that they lined it up for Raymond Washington. And I thought about it. I said, it makes so much sense to think that they would use him as an MK Ultra patient like they did Sirhan Sirhan. If many of you haven't read the story or seen the video on Sirhan Sirhan, it's very mysterious that they see things go down. They can't remember anything other than seeing, say, for instance, the symbol of a polka dot dress or something like that. And they end up in prison, and the evidence doesn't fit the crime, but politically they're just being held there. So what they did is that they created the Crips, and they basically got Raymond Washington, and they used this technology on him when they took him to prison or whatever, whenever they did it. And this is why we get the conflicting stories on, like Fitz's daughter's interview about how she remembered her father and the good things and so forth, and everything that everyone else said about her father, she really couldn't piece it together. When you look at the origin of the term Crip, in every video that you find today, you will not see where they are explaining to you where someone sat down and said, yeah, this is what the acronym Crips mean. It's always fuzzy when you get to that part. And then the way that Raymond dies is no different than any other way that they kill something that has too much information, or to start a wider conflict among people so that you can get the outcome that you intended to get in the first place. So when I understood it that way, that was more of Allah showing me how this was not something that can be sanctioned or looked at in a way that is approved by him. So when Pineapple shared this information with me, I really started to ask people, that were much older than me about what they remember, and they really couldn't explain anything to me. So then from there on, there was no looking back. I focused more just on my religious studies and trying to get out of prison. At this stage, I was about to start going to the parole board, and I was walking the yard, and I bumped into Big James Miller from Harlem Crip. He was in a program that was sort of like the Scared Straight, where they were, bringing the young kids off the streets and trying to talk to them about, not being involved with gang violence. This program brought me in contact with a young brother's nephew. He was an OG brother from Mona Park. I used to go out in Compton with the brother T-Bone from 9-7. And his name was Dirty Dan from Mona Park. I ended up seeing his nephew. And, we sat at the table. And as a matter of fact, I joined the program with Big James Miller. And one thing that he told me, and I want everybody to always remember this, if it's not written down, if it's not recorded, then you have no evidence of it. So he told me, he said, when you're going to the parole board, I don't care how much you've learned out of a book. You have to have something on paper certifying that you know this. So I started to join these programs. And when I bumped into Dirty Dan's nephews, I was able to not only speak to them about, spirituality, because one of the first things that I asked them was that, how did you guys grow up? How did you start making the mistakes that you were making? Was everything good at home? And I said, where do you guys live at? And when they told me around Mona Park, I was like, yeah, Mona Park. I said, I used to gang bang and knew some people from out of Mona Park. And he was like, yeah, who? I was like, Dirty Dan. He was like, Dirty Dan? He was like, yeah. He said, that's my uncle. I'm like, what? I was like, Black Dirty Dan? He was like, yeah. So it shows you that everything from then on that I was saying to them brothers at the table, they looked at me as if I was their father. When I told them how I ended up in prison and how hard it was for me to try to get out, and how the only thing that was keeping me together was the fact that I understood that life is only temporary. We have no control over how it's going to end. And so I left that with a good, giving a good impression to them. And it would only make things better and better. In my next video, I'll be discussing the visions. Since I was a child, I always had visions of things that would happen in the future. But I never did go out looking for those things to happen. It's just when people started speaking about it, I would always remember the dream that I had. There are a few of them, and I will be mentioning them in part 6. Assalamu alaikum.